If I believe that society is very unequal and that's a problem, I will demand higher redistribution or different policies than if I believe inequality is low and I couldn't care less, right? Then I wouldn't demand redistribution. So in that sense, it matters what I think about inequality. Now, the point is that inequality perceptions are not necessarily aligned with actual inequality as measured. Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Crozer, your host for the Inequalities channel presented by Traces&dreams. And today is actually not just another episode of Future Frame TV Inequalities channel. Today is the anniversary episode. We're airing again for the 52nd time, 1 year full of Inequalities talks. And for this special anniversary episode, we've decided to change the roles a little bit. And that's why I'm here today with a very special guest, who is Nerina Finetto. Nerina is the editor and the brain and the heart and the soul behind Future Frame TV and Traces&dreams. And she's going to share her experience about the channel with me. And I am going to share my experience about this channel all over this year with you today. Welcome to the program, Nerina.
Thank you so much, Alice. Such a pleasure being here with you today and to celebrate 1 year of Inequalities talks on Future Frame TV. And I really thank you for all the great conversation that I were able to listen to. Thank you for your great guest. And I was thinking that our audience would like to know more about your journey with this podcast and how you felt during this very special year for many reasons, a very special year. How was this experience, Alice, for you?
How was this experience? Sounds almost like I'll start crying because it's a close. I think it was a fantastic experience in the sense that I learned a lot, and I'm incredibly grateful to all the fantastic guests that I had and to all of you watching the program and asking questions and commenting. And also especially grateful to you and the editing team and all the effort behind the scenes that we don't usually see when we have the final conversation, right? So it's a really great job. I think for me, it was an interesting learning trajectory path because I've been researching inequalities for a number of years now. And I feel that with every conversation, I learned something new, some interesting aspect that I either hadn't considered before or a detail that fell into place. And it's very different to talk to people about their experience with researching inequalities than to read their academic papers or whatever output they have, right? So in that sense, I think I learned a lot more about the motivations people have to research these subjects and about the reasons in general for researching issues related to inequality, and also about the topic breadth that exists when we talk about inequalities, right? We can think about all the episodes we had on economic inequalities, social inequalities, ethnic racial inequalities, gender inequalities, forms of organizing family life, forms of organizing social life in society at large, forms of organizing international communities. So there's so many different layers to it. And I've been thinking about it in terms of the macro, the international layers, and then the more meso level of communities or societies, countries, and then also the micro level of the individuals, the relations between people, right? And in that sense, I think it was incredibly enriching. And I'm very humbled to have been able to speak to so many fantastic researchers about their really interesting and engaging research.
Well, and so it was really, for me, every time that I received your recording, it was really an experience. And I discovered as you just mentioned, so different aspects of inequalities. And every time, actually, I would have loved to meet this person and deepen the conversation because they are so exciting topics. But I believe that our audience is also really interested in knowing what you have been doing besides this podcast. What have you been working on last year, Alice?
Oh, yeah, that's an excellent question. On the one hand, I think I've been working in my head a lot and like coping with the situation, trying to think about what it means that we are in a lockdown that's not a lockdown, in a slowdown that's not really a slowdown, because on the one hand, there's an extreme acceleration in terms of communication online and these kind of things. And then there's a very harsh slowdown in terms of physical movement. outside of one's home, maybe, or outside of one's improvised gym or whatever people do. And I think that leaves a lot of space to think and to reconceptualize the world and our society and oneself, right? I mean, so it's been a journey inside to some degree. And then on the other hand, on a more inequality, it's also inequalities related. On a project level, maybe, I've been working a lot on the question of perceptions of inequality, especially with regards to redistribution. So questions of the society we want to have. If we agree as individuals and as society, which we do, that inequality is too large, inequalities are too large and too many, and most societies do agree about this these days. And that's also why, to some degree, the conversation about inequalities has been a lot louder now than a couple of years ago, when it was less well regarded to talk about these subjects, maybe, especially in certain disciplines. But so one of the reasons why this conversation is louder, as I say, is because societies are very unsatisfied with the level of inequality. It's far too high. So then the question becomes, what do we want to do about it? And actually, it's not so straightforward what we want to do about it as a society, because people are not so keen on redistributing money, for example. And specifically, some groups are less keen to do so than others, and that's usually the ones that have more of it. So what we find, for example, in our research that we've been conducting for a couple of years now, and we recently, a couple of weeks ago, finished another survey on perceptions of redistribution. What we find is that people in Mexico are they're very unhappy with the inequality levels. They wish for a society that's much more equal. However, they're also very unwilling to, for example, support a progressive tax redistribution, or a more progressive tax redistribution than the system that exists today. And that's a conundrum, because we don't really know how to get out of that. And I think that one of the things that have changed in my head, conceptualizing these issues, is that of course, I'm an academic. I believe in knowledge. I believe that there's an impact in generating knowledge or facts. And we find that people are surprisingly resistant to facts and to knowledge, in the sense that it's not necessarily the case that people presented with new knowledge will actually change their mind. So then the question of how to get from what we desire, a more equal society, to actually having it, when we don't want to contribute the necessary amount, especially financially, it becomes a challenge. So that's what we're working on now, to figure out how to overcome this challenge.
Alice, what kind of question did you ask, or how did you do this, so that we understand more how you get your data, if you want?
Yeah, for example, we asked in our surveys whether people feel that their society is represented by a specific figure, right? So we presented them with 6 different figures of how societies could look like, from a very unequal distribution to a very equal or an exactly equal distribution. And we said, which one of those 6 figures represents, to your understanding, the society you live in? And then people could choose. And actually it turns out that people are quite well aware of what inequality looks like in Mexico. And that's not necessarily the case in all countries. So other researchers have found in other countries, people underestimate inequality vastly, and also in some few places they overestimate it. It turns out here people understand that the distribution is very unequal, and also kind of how unequal it is. What people don't really understand is that the social mobility, for example, so that's the amount of people that are able to get out of poverty in their lifetime and go into a wealthier position, or the other way around, people that start off in a wealthier position and that end up in a lower socioeconomic position. That's social mobility over lifetime. People overestimate this tremendously. So they think it's relatively easy. They actually believe that a third of people that are born in the lowest 20% of the population will end up in the highest 20% of the population over their lifetime. That's an incredible overestimation. Because really, in Mexico, it's about 2% that make this trip instead of 30%, right? Or 30-some% that people thought. So there is a misunderstanding of not how high inequality is, but how we get to these levels, or why they're so persistent, right? And this has, we think, something to do with the fact that people estimate the shape of inequality differently. So depending on where they're located in society, they have a different image of how inequality, the actual features of inequality, how it looks like. So, for example, people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum believe that inequality exists and is large, but it starts from a lower level, poverty, to, let's say, intermediate level for what is wealth. So the spectrum is not as large, if you will. So if you think about somebody from the upper socioeconomic spectrum, they think that wealth starts way higher. So they have a different idea of wealth. And they also think that poverty starts higher. So you have to be richer to be poor, which means that they actually look at very different ranges of incomes to understand inequality. And the people that have a better understanding empirically of inequality are the ones that are in between, right? So they probably have more access to information towards the bottom and towards the top, right? Whereas both ends are kind of stuck in their own worlds, if you will, or they have more exposure to their own world. And this difference in perception means that they also have a different understanding of how social mobility works, for example, or what inequality means and the impacts it will have. And it also, what we also find, and that's related to this threshold of where poverty and wealth start, is that in general, everybody overestimates the amount of wealthy people that exist in society. So they have a fairly good understanding of a big amount of, or a large part of society being poor or living in conditions of vulnerability and poverty, but they overestimate vastly the amount of wealthy people that exist. So for example, to put it in numbers, in Mexico, people thought that wealth starts with roughly 40,000 pesos monthly income, which then they thought affects about, I think they said, a third of the population. So you'd have a third of the population being rich. And really, the income threshold of 40,000 pesos only applies for about 1% of the population or less. So there's an incredible overestimation. So when people think that wealth is fairly widespread, so there's a lot of wealthy people, and then they think these wealthy people have to contribute, I don't know, in terms of taxes, for example, and they do so. So then redistribution can work and social mobility can work, etc. But if really this is a misconception and there are far fewer wealthy people that are contributing to the system, obviously this results in a completely different scenario. So that's the other conundrum. And that's also the thing that we are still looking at now. How do we reconcile these different perceptions of inequality, and not only in terms of the trend and the level, but of the actual shape of inequality?
And so there was also one of the conversation that you had recently. It was also the point that we keep living in really different bubbles that underline the fact that we have different perceptions of reality, if you want. But Alice, why? This is also always the question about the why. Why is the perception so relevant? And if I think about the fact that you say the poor people, they believe that they can make it to the other side, if you want. This is not realistic as it is. I think, but it's good that they believe this, because if they would know that there is very, very little hope to change their situation, perhaps it would be even worse. But besides this aspect, perhaps, why is the perception so relevant at a societal level, if you want? Why would we need a perception that is more equal, to mention the equal aspect of it?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because there are different importances to it. And one is exactly what you say, is on the individual level, right? So it's important for people to justify and to understand their position and their aspiration, or their options for aspiration, right? Which are different depending on where in the socioeconomic spectrum somebody sits or is located and perceives to be located. So somebody in a socioeconomically poorer position would, of course, have to have this hope of being able to change the situation, because else, they might as well give up. And on the other hand, somebody in a very wealthy position might also need a legitimizing factor there, because else they don't feel they deserve the position, or there's different cognitive conflicts with being in this position of maybe undeserved wealth compared to somebody else, right? So on the other hand, there are policy implications related to perceptions of inequality. And that's because researchers have realized, although it was long believed that inequality levels as measured determine policy preferences, that actually it's inequality perceptions that determine preferences of policies, like, for example, redistribution. So if I believe that society is very unequal and that's a problem, I will probably demand higher redistribution or different policies than if I believe inequality is low and I couldn't care less, right? Then I wouldn't demand redistribution. So in that sense, it matters what I think about inequality. Now, the point is that inequality perceptions are not necessarily aligned with actual inequality as measured. And that's what I was alluding to before, that in Mexico, we found that that actually people do know how high inequality levels are, but they are not necessarily aware of other aspects of inequality, like, for example, social mobility. And there is another curious fact in there when we think about perception versus reality, so to speak, that people, when they're asked about social mobility, they tend to think about an ideal situation where everybody moves up. So we're talking about something called, in technical terms, absolute social mobility. However, when we as social scientists measure social mobility, usually we think about relative social mobility, which means that some will go up and others will go down. So in absolute terms, we only have 100%. So if 20% go up, then 20% have to go down, right? And people don't think about it like that when they're asked about that, people that are not researchers in the subject. So then we also have to think about the concepts that we use and which are the concepts that are important when we measure inequality, right? And we see how different measured aspects of inequality, like social mobility, which of course is related because it says something about the change and the possibility of change and of equality of opportunity, right? So the way we measure this matters for how people perceive it. And how people perceive it will matter for what they demand as an outcome. So in that sense, perceptions and actual measurements matter. They're both important for knowing what we want or what we demand as policy outcomes, but they're not necessarily the same.
Interesting what you mentioned, that people dream, if you want, of a better society, a more equal society, but they are not willing perhaps to contribute to make it more equal. How can we handle it? How can we explain it? How could we react on it?
Yeah, these are three different important questions. Well, first of all, maybe before how we can handle it, I'd say how we figured out that people didn't want to contribute to it. And we asked people whether they would be willing to, or how much they would be willing to contribute of an imaginary income for there to be no inequality and no poverty. So this is a very specific question about social justice. This is not actually a question about tax, because we also ask them about their ideal tax rate and how much they would like to pay in taxes, how much they would like others to pay in taxes, so people with higher or low income. But in that specific question, we ask them about their notion of social justice. And it turns out that in Mexico, in general, people are willing to contribute very little compared to other countries. There are a few other countries for which similar studies exist, and people there are willing to contribute more. In Mexico, we found that on average, it's about 12% of this imaginary income that people want to contribute. Now, the interesting thing there is that we found that there is a difference by wealth in terms of how much they want to contribute. So people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum are willing to contribute more for there to be no inequality and poverty, while people that are wealthier are willing to contribute less. So in numbers, that's about 12-15% versus 7% of this imaginary income that they're willing to contribute, right? So it's almost half what wealthy people want to contribute. So this is something about the social glue, maybe, or the importance of these subjects for different socioeconomic groups, right? So obviously, we think about poorer people benefiting more from there to be no poverty and no inequality, while richer people maybe think they would benefit less. That is, of course, a little bit of a premature conclusion, because we know that societies that are more equal also have better indicators of all sorts of welfare, social welfare facts like health and security, etc. Right? So actually, everybody in a society benefits if it's more equal and there is no poverty and no inequality, even if it's not for, let's say, ethical purposes that people support it. I mean, even for instrumental purposes, people should support more equal societies. But so if we know this, how we can handle this dilemma is, we still have to, although I think there's maybe some more limited value in this than I thought before. We still have to inform people about what the actual levels are, right? So that people can see where there's a discrepancy between what the world looks like outside of this bubble, if you will, and not necessarily only for themselves, but for other people as well, and to adjust their perceptions accordingly. And on the other hand, we probably also have to push for policies that lead to an outcome where people see this in effect, right? So what I mean by this is that usually before big changes in society, there's always a lot of resistance. So if we think about, for example, the introduction of universal primary education, there was a lot of resistance before, and that's not good for the children, and then they cannot work, etc. Right? There were many arguments. And once it's established, there's virtually no discussion about it anymore that it's beneficial, right? And it's something similar when there is universal healthcare introduced in the UK, for example, the national health system, the NHS in the UK. There was a lot of discussion before, and we cannot pay for it, and it's impossible, etc. And once it's there, nobody wants to get rid of it. Well, until very recent years, right? So there is a little bit of an argument for trying to have a better system in terms of inequality. And then people can say, oh, yeah, that's true. That would actually have been better. And that's a little bit of what happened, for example, in the Scandinavian countries as well. It's not that they demanded higher taxes from the outset, but now they agree that it's a good idea to have them because other things are financed with them. So in general, I think politicians have to be a lot more outspoken and supportive of these redistributive policies. And that's something that unfortunately we have not seen much here. In other countries we have, right? And there are some movements now also with the global new global wealth tax in quotation marks, which can be discussed about how good it is in terms of its level, etc. But the idea is, of course, it's a necessary thing, right? And in Mexico, the discussion about taxes is not so positive in that sense. There is a lot of prejudice about it, and there's a lot of misconception about it as well. What do we need taxes for? It's not actually to take something away from somebody else who deserves it. It's to ensure a more equal society, right? And it serves as a means of redistribution, but it also serves as a means to give out other things that come, as an income for the state, right? So it has this dual objective of redistribution. That's why it's such an effective policy, and that's something that has to be changed in the discourse here.
Because you mentioned the fact that if we share facts with people, they might not change their mind or their opinion. And this is one of my favorite topics. How can we work so that we can change minds, change opinions? And from my point of view, the power of narratives and storytellings in this. You mentioned exactly how people perceive taxes. And so how do you see this big question about telling different stories? This is one of the part that what we are doing also with this podcast to contribute really to reframe the discourse and not only to share data or facts, but to share stories and to change the narratives in this kind of as a topic, if you want.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the approach that is promising and necessary. And that is because, in a way, there has been a very successful narrative. And that's the one that is reigning today. And that successful narrative says that taxes are something bad and that government should stay out of this business. And many sectors still believe that. And everybody has what they deserve, etc. Right? Even if it was the case that we live in a society where everybody has what they deserve, which is clearly not the case. But even if it were the case, I'm not sure that's a desirable thing, right? Because it means something like, well, if you're poor, you deserve it, and, too bad. And then you're stuck there. And I much prefer to live in a context where nobody lives under these conditions, whether that's in quotations deserved or not. So you're absolutely right that we have to work on these narratives. I think that is one incredibly important thing, that people associate stories with something they can remember, something they can relate to. And there's this whole emotional part to it, which is very often detached from facts, right? I mean, sometimes facts are so shocking that we change our minds because we're just puzzled by them. But very often stories are more able to connect with our emotional relation to this. And I think the other very important component here is that we increase the interaction between people that are different. And that's for all different groups, because that's the one factor that we know reliably creates empathy. When there actually is interaction between groups that are in an unequal society, very often segregated. And that's one of the curious issues in most unequal countries, and Mexico being one of them, definitely the case here as well. You have a lot of segregation, not only in spatial terms, but also in cultural terms, in social terms. So people don't really spend time in the same schools, in the same hospitals, in the same museums, in the same bars, or in the same streets. However, they're exactly one street away from each other. So it's a little bit of a surprise that people that live in one neighborhood have zero understanding of people in another neighborhood. You know, if we think just about the spatial dimension. But if we consider that also they have no friends in these areas, they don't use the same transport or means of transport, they don't go to the same schools, etc., then we understand that it's very difficult to relate to the reality of other people when that reality is different, right? So if we have a possibility to interact in spaces, like, for example, educational spaces or recreational spaces or whatever social public spaces we have, then the chances that we understand each other and that we worry about the other and that we feel empathy and that we want to contribute to somebody that we have a relationship with or that we can at least relate to are much higher, I think.
Alice, you mentioned that when we think about social mobility, we think very often that we go up, but we do not think about going down. And I'm wondering if we, at the general level, if we do not actually would need to rethink the whole narrative about what is valuable, what is a life worth living, what kind of things are important in life, how important it is to be rich and to be at a societal level more honest about the fact that not everybody can be super rich. That is not realistic. Also, there is not only the way up for everybody, and this is not possible. Also, how do you say about this change of values, if you want that perspective?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it's important to consider, what does going up mean? It's a more philosophical or ethical question, if you will. Of course, the measurement of social mobility has to be based on some kind of indicator. So we choose some, and in this case, we choose income because that's something instrumental that can lead to other goods, let's say, or well-beings. But I think it's very important, what you say, to question whether the aspiration should be to not necessarily be better off. I mean, I think that's something kind of, I don't know if natural, but something, even if constructed, very human, to think that we want to improve our situation and we want to improve the situation for our children, etc. But we don't necessarily have to think about it in terms of all becoming multimillionaires that fly to space with their, or billionaires, with their amassed goods by whatever means they are amassed, right? And I don't think that is actually the objective for most people. I think there is a fascination with figures that do this kind of stuff, for better or worse. The fascination is for better or worse. But I don't think most people aspire a position like that. And in that sense, it's very important to consider other indicators of well-being. And I think this particular crisis that we're living right now, which is a curious coupling of economic and social and psychological crises at the same time, right? Which on the one hand gives us or inhibits many people from going to work, and on the other hand creates all these new challenges of what has to be done in the meantime, and also being at home and having leisure and not being able to spend money because there's no income, or the other way around, being at home with a lot of housework or children's work that was not considered before, etc. Right? So it's a very curious situation that I think has lots of people reconsider the importance of social relations way beyond the economic dimension, right? And also the mental and of course physical well-being that becomes a lot more prominent in this crisis than maybe many people have thought about before, right? If you were fairly healthy before, you probably didn't spend as much time thinking about your health as you do in times of a pandemic, right? So this is something very particular to the situation. So in this sense, I completely agree that there has to be a realignment of values, if you will, in this narrative. Maybe not for all individuals because they were not so disaligned, but in terms of how we present these issues. And there, I'd like to briefly come back to the question of relative versus absolute mobility, right? Because that also relates here. That it's perfectly possible for being better off, for everybody being better off, if we don't have this absolute limit of physical goods, right? Everybody could be healthier or happier or whatever the criteria are that we use. If we think about it in percentage terms, when some go up, others will go down. But this doesn't actually say anything about their absolute position, right? In principle, everybody could go up and be better off. Just if we calculate it in percentage, then somebody will have to go down. That being said, the current race to higher income is definitely not sustainable if anything ecologically, right? So there's no way that everybody could have a billionaire's position and race to space because that's just not sustainable. So in that sense, of course, we have to reconsider these issues. And I think that's also maybe to come back to the lectures of this or what I learned from these conversations is that these limits, like the ecological limit, like also social cohesion limits, they're very real, and we kind of ignore them blissfully for some time until something crazy happens, and then we're like, there was an ecological problem, or well, there's a pandemic, and I think we should just be a lot more considerate about these issues from before, right? They of course they not only can happen, they do happen, and so we should stay within our ecological means as far as possible.
Yes, definitely. And because we are running out of time a little bit, you used to ending your interview asking the people how did they get interested in the topic. And this is the question I would like to ask you right now. How did you get interested in this topic?
Yeah, it's a very easy question to ask, and it's actually a very difficult question to answer, because I don't think I can remember a time when I was not interested in these topics. And I remember even as a child that the sense of social justice that was probably inculcated by my family or my environment was very superior to many other senses. So I think it's a topic that I've been raised with, social justice and equality. But I also think that it has something to do with a specific context, maybe in which I grew up with a family coming from former Soviet context in Europe, and growing up, spending a large part of my life in Scandinavia. And so that's regions where equality is a lot closer to, I'm not saying it exists in absolute terms, but it's a lot less, these contexts are in some ways at least a lot less unequal than the context that I'm currently living in, which is in Mexico. So once I get from one to the other, I see this difference in what is possible. And knowing that there are these differences in inequality level means that it is possible to get from one to the other. And this possibility motivates me to continue working on improving the situation towards more equality in those places that are less equal today, right? Because I know it's possible, and something has to be done to improve the situation.
I'm sure that you and me, also, we really believe that we can change the situation, and we keep dreaming about this, and we're working on it. And I found really interesting what you said at the very beginning of this conversation, also speaking about the COVID situation, that everything slowed down, actually, also physically. But for all this interaction that we had online, it really, in a way, sped up. And I really wish for you and for me and for our society, if you want, to have the time again to slow down and to take this opportunity really to reflect on what happened this year, because the feeling that I have right now is there are so many people really dreaming of going back to what we thought that is the normal or the normal situation, that I feel that we we left in this speeded up world, if you want, and we are again speeding up again, losing the chance, if you want, to really rethink and redefine what is normal, what is worth living, and what kind of value we should really try to achieve at a personal and societal level. Thank you, Alice, for sharing with us, your journey, if you want.
Well, thank you, Nerina, for your wonderful questions and for, having this conversation with me here about topics that are kind of my everyday work, but also, as you say, really need some reflection time every now and then. And I think it's adequate to then now announce that there will be a reflection time coming up. We'll go on a summer or winter break, depending on where you're located. And we will be back somewhere in the fall with a new season of the Inequalities channel. And we hope that you would want to go on a reflection time yourself as well. And maybe you want to comment or send us your ideas about the channel, about the topic, about guests, etc., whatever you would like to see in the new season of Inequalities from Future Frame TV. And we hope that you'll join us again then after the summer winter break. Nerina, thank you so much for being here with me today. It was such a pleasure to have you, talk to you, and have you in my life as well.
Alice, it is really a pleasure having you in my life. And I think that we should really thank you also, Alexander, who is the one who has been editing these episodes this last year. And I thank you for all what we have done last year and looking forward to the next episodes.
Thank you. Thank you, Nerina. Thank you, Alexander. And thank you all for watching another episode, the anniversary episode of Future Frame TV. And I'm Elise Grozer, your host for the Inequalities channel, to be back after the break in the fall. Have a nice afternoon and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.